Hey guys, today I want to talk a little bit about exercise progression. It's a really tricky thing when you're getting started out with prescribing exercises or when you're working with a patient to pick what the next best step is in the progression line of what this person should be doing. Often the first little step or two is pretty easy. You've done your evaluation, you've assessed, you've sort of come up with a priority list of limitations in that person, and then you give them some stuff that is the best step for them based on their assessment. Then when they come back, you reassess. They may have progressed here or there, but not all over the place. They've made some progress, but it might not be like shining light, like jumping off the scale progression. And we start to think like, what should we do next? What should we do next? And so it's really important is to be thinking about things rather than what's the next best exercise from what I gave them there. You need to start thinking about like, what is the best stimulus that will be another challenge for this person. So how can we escalate the demands of this activity in a way that will challenge the problem, challenge the limitation in that patient or person or client, whichever, however you refer to them. And so a really simple way to do that, which I've been working with over a long period of time now, is using postural positioning or postural demand as the fundamental factor that you are modifying. So we've kind of put the primary factor. Once you've established what their limitation is, then we're going to pick a progression line or work in a progression line of escalating difficulty. And we need to work on that escalating difficulty based on something. And now, over the time, I found that using load or repetitions or volume isn't necessarily a great thing, because it doesn't challenge them to do anything differently. It just challenges them to do more of the same thing, which is okay in some instances, but it runs out very quickly. You can only continue to do so much. And it's a problem that a lot of physical therapy or physio, osteo, chiro tend to run into, is that they're not using frameworks for progression. They're using increasing demands as progression, right? They're using add more. So then instead of doing 2 lots of 20, they're doing 2 lots of 30, 2 lots of 50, 2 lots of 100, 3 times a day. And it just becomes too much. So there's no structure to it. So a simpler way to progress the demands, to make something more challenging, not to just make it harder, is to use your primary variable as the postural demand. And so an example of this would be, let's say the first thing you give somebody when they come in is a glute activation, like a hip bridge, for instance. They're lying down, right? So they're lying on their back, or they're supine. So then there's no postural demand. There's very, very little postural demand. They're lying down. They don't have to hold their head. They don't have to balance. All they have to do is lay there and push into a band or lift their bum off the table, right? And so the postural demand is very low. So to progress that is quite simple. And you would do this intuitively to a degree, but then it gets a little bit more murky as you go down the line. So the first step, you go, well, how do you make the postural demand harder? Well, the simplest thing to do is to narrow the base of support. So by taking 1 foot off the floor, you're increasing the postural demand. You're increasing the stability requirement of them stabilizing their pelvis from losing lumbar pelvic control when they bridge up, right? So progressing that on is to go for like a single leg bridge, which is narrowed base of support. So you've narrowed off, you're lying on the back doing a bridge, then you go to single leg bridge, which is narrowing the base of support. Then how would you progress that? Well, you can add weight to it, you can add resistance to it, so then you can up the ante of these two, no problem, by just adding resistance and adding load, but you're not changing the postural demand, are you? It's just adding load and adding repetition. So to increase the postural demand, we've got to change position. So how can we change position? Well, you can go onto your side. Side lying and stacking and holding a nice neutral spinal position, not just collapsing onto the table and laying there relaxed, but lifting from the ribs underneath on the table and maintaining your pelvis and your shoulders and your head in a nice neutral line position while doing a hip exercise is more posturally demanding if you make it about the postural demand. So going into sideline and controlling sideline. Then you could go into quadruped or over onto all fours. So all fours, or whatever you want to call it, quadruped. Then we could go into narrowing the base of support off in quadruped. So going from quadruped to trying to lift, alternate hands, leg off the floor. Doing some crawling, walking forwards, walking backwards. Bird dog type movements. They're all quadruped movements that have a changing postural demand that they have to dynamically adapt to. And so you unearth weaknesses in their postural control on the way through. Then, so you can reduce the base of support again. Then, once we've got control there, what do we go to next? Well, to make quadruped more posturally demanding, we need to start to get upright. You need to take the shoulders out of the equation and be able to control your postural positioning without the 4 points of contact or 3 points or 2 points of contact. So we're going to go up into, say, tall kneeling or half kneeling, depending on what. Let's say tall kneeling to begin with. Tall kneeling, and by tall kneeling we mean 2 knees on the floor, standing upright, yeah, or kneeling upright if you like. Then half kneeling is narrowing that base, narrowing that base off again, which is effectively resting in a lunge position, but with your knee 90 degrees at the back, 90 degrees at the front, and you can narrow that base down. So you can start with a wider support, split stance, and then narrow it down into a really narrowed base. So with these, where then this step down again is narrowing the base of support. Sorry about the handwriting. Then you follow the flow here. Now we're going from half kneeling, then we can go into standing. Standing with 2 legs. Standing bilateral. So we increase the postural demand again. Now you've got to control the knees, control the pelvis, control everything along the way. That postural sway and the ankle stability. Then we can go, how do we do it? We reduce the base of support. So we can go into like a tandem stance effectively, right? So now we go tandem stance. Which is again, reducing the base of support. Then single leg stance, which is again, reducing the base of support. So you can see, and like along this line, you can be doing a whole range of movements. Pushing, pulling, rotating, throwing, catching, squatting, lunging, hinging, stepping, like whatever the movements, you can be as creative as you want to be with what they're doing while you're progressing them through these postural demands. And the same thing can apply to the shoulder, to the midsection, to the hips, to the ankles, to the knees. It doesn't matter. It's a primary focus of progression, which underpins everything that you do. And the benefit of following something like this is you can layer in loading at each different point, and this can be a really amazing progression line which runs, for this person from an acute rehab state all the way back to high performance. So the scope is huge for progressing somebody along that line, but it's a very simple, fundamental, principle that you're working within. And when it comes to communicating that to your patient, it's very easy to explain. We're making it more challenging by increasing the demands on your postural control. See, you're more wobbly. It's harder to do this halo when you're in in tandem stance to when you're in a bilateral neutral stance. So the stability demands are more, so it's harder for you to control, which puts more stress on X, Y, Z, and more challenge for you to navigate, which will make you better at navigating a problem out in the real world, outside of the gym, outside of your exercise physiology sessions. So progression lines using, say, postural demand, you can pick a range of different things, but I love the postural demand as a progression sequence or a progression framework that underpins everything else, because it allows you freedom for creativity, freedom for progression, and not having to worry about what the next best exercise is, because you're working with the next best challenge for the patient in front of you.